I never thought I'd be here, sharing my personal nightmare with strangers on the internet. But maybe writing this will help me make sense of everything, or at least get some perspective. My wife, Diane, and I have been together for over 30 years. We built a comfortable life together. I run a business that took decades to grow from the ground up, and Diane was always the face of our home, so to speak. She was my partner in every way I thought possible, or so I believed. We have a long-standing tradition of taking an extended summer holiday every year. It's something we started when our kids were young, finding a villa somewhere warm with sun and sand and spending a few uninterrupted weeks there. This year was supposed to be no different. We booked a beautiful villa on the coast, overlooking the water, and planned to unwind after a particularly stressful year for both of us. I imagined this trip would be a chance for us to reconnect, to enjoy each other's company away from the daily grind. The first few days were idyllic, as always. Lazy breakfasts on the terrace, afternoons spent lounging by the pool, and quiet dinners with a view of the sea. But right from the start, something felt off with Diane. She seemed distracted, on edge. She started making excuses to do things alone, like going for morning meditation walks or exploring the local town while I stayed back at the villa. At first, I chalked it up to her just wanting some personal time. We'd both been under stress, and I thought maybe she just needed to decompress. Then came the phone. Diane has always been relatively indifferent to technology. She'd even joke about how I was glued to my phone for work. But now, all of a sudden, it was like her phone had become a permanent attachment. She'd take it with her everywhere, even to the pool, which she'd never done before. And she'd be texting constantly. At night, I'd catch her tapping away, staring at the screen with a little smile I hadn't seen in a long time. I told myself I was overthinking things. 30 years of marriage, after all, but there was this knot in my gut that wouldn't go away. The days passed, and Diane's strange behavior continued, becoming harder to ignore. She started disappearing for longer stretches, always with some excuse that seemed oddly vague or out of character. One morning, she claimed she'd found a beach yoga group and was going to join them for a session at sunrise. Now, let me tell you, Diane has never been a morning person, let alone someone who'd willingly crawl out of bed at 5 a.m. to stretch in the sand. But when I questioned it, she brushed me off, saying she needed time to reconnect with herself. That's when I started feeling that prickling unease you get when you know something's wrong, but can't quite put your finger on it. I've spent my life around people, reading them, working with them. It's how I built my business. And yet, here I was, unable to understand the person I'd spent more than 3 decades with. A few days later, things took another turn. Diane announced she was heading into town to meet up with some locals she'd met while shopping. I was taken aback. She's always been wary of strangers, especially in new places. I offered to come along. Maybe I could join her, meet these friends. But she laughed it off, saying it was a girls-only thing and that she didn't want me to feel out of place. When she left, I watched her go, her phone glued to her hand, fingers tapping rapidly at the screen as she walked down the villa's stone path. That night, she returned much later than expected. I'd been sitting on the terrace, nursing a drink and staring out over the darkened ocean, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. But when Diane finally came back, there was something off. She was laughing, almost giddy, with a slightly flushed face like she'd been drinking. And then, as she leaned in to kiss me goodnight, I caught the faintest scent of men's cologne, not my own, and not something she would ever wear. I asked her, as casually as I could manage, about her evening. She went on about the wonderful locals she'd met, how they'd taken her to a hidden gem of a restaurant in town. A real, authentic experience, she called it. But something didn't sit right. Her eyes avoided mine as she spoke, and there was a defensiveness in her tone, like she was daring me to challenge her. That night, as I lay in bed next to her, I felt a strange mix of anger and confusion gnawing at me. Could it really be happening? After everything we'd been through, all the years, all the memories? I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself down, but the questions kept pounding in my head. This was no longer just a gut feeling. Something was wrong, and I knew I needed to get to the bottom of it. The following morning, I woke up to find Diane already gone. She'd left a note on the kitchen counter. Went for an early walk along the beach. Don't wait up. I'll probably grab breakfast in town. It was written in her usual handwriting, neat and practiced, but something about it felt so clinical, so detached, like she was just going through the motions of letting me know where she was. I sat there, reading that note over and over, feeling my irritation grow. She'd never been this distant on our trips before. In the past, we spent every minute together, exploring new places, chatting over meals, lying side by the pool. This version of Diane was a stranger, always somewhere else, always unreachable. So I decided to take matters into my own hands. I threw on some clothes, grabbed my keys, and decided to head into town. If she was grabbing breakfast, then maybe I'd surprise her, drop by, and have breakfast together. After all, what was wrong with a husband wanting to join his wife on a morning out? The town was just waking up when I arrived, with a handful of tourists and locals wandering the narrow streets. I went from one cafe to the next, scanning the tables and terraces, hoping to catch a glimpse of Diane. But she was nowhere to be found. At each spot, I'd ask if they'd seen a woman fitting her description, usually getting polite, puzzled looks in return. About an hour in, I finally spotted her. Or rather, I spotted her scarf. It was a distinctive silk scarf I'd bought her last Christmas, in a pattern I would recognize anywhere. She was at a small cafe, tucked behind a line of bougainvillea, sitting at a corner table with her back to me. My heart sped up as I made my way over, eager to finally confront her and get some answers. But before I could get too close, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Across from her sat a man, younger, probably mid-30s, and they were leaning in close, talking in hushed tones. Diane was smiling, that same giddy, flushed look she'd had when she returned from her night out. And then, as I watched, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his, giving it a squeeze that was far too intimate to be platonic. I felt the world tilt slightly as I stood there, watching them, hidden behind a cluster of plants. A mixture of disbelief, hurt, and rage boiled up inside me. This was no local friend or yoga buddy. This was someone else, someone she was hiding, someone she clearly felt comfortable enough to meet with while I was supposedly left out of her personal independence nonsense. I left without saying a word, my mind racing as I headed back to the villa. The betrayal stung like nothing I'd ever felt before, but I knew one thing. I wasn't about to let this slide. This wasn't something she could just talk her way out of. I needed a plan, a way to show her just how much she'd underestimated me, and to make sure she understood the consequences of her choices. When I returned to the villa, I sat in silence, trying to calm the storm of emotions surging through me. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal, it was overwhelming. But I knew I couldn't let emotions take control. Diane had made her choice, and now I needed to make mine. If I confronted her now, she'd deny it, twist the story, make excuses. No, I had to be smarter than that. I needed proof. Solid, undeniable evidence. I started by going over everything I already knew, replaying her odd behavior in my mind, the strange absences, the late nights out. I'd always been the one who trusted, who believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. I'd given her more than that, 30 years of it, in fact. But now it was time to approach this with cold calculation. If she was hiding something, I was going to find it. After a few minutes, I decided to start with her phone. She'd left it charging by the nightstand, and I could hear the shower running in the bathroom. I took a deep breath and picked it up, my hands almost shaking as I unlocked it. Diane wasn't particularly tech-savvy, and she didn't even bother to put a password on her device. It felt strange, invasive even, to be looking through her phone, but I reminded myself why I was doing this. I needed to know the truth. As I scrolled through her messages, nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first. Mostly text to our kids, a few friends, and a lot of spam. But then, buried near the bottom of her contacts, I found a name I didn't recognize. Marie. Marie had no last name, no profile picture, and their conversation was kept deliberately vague. But the messages were frequent, and I quickly noticed the language was coded, almost as if they were trying to avoid detection. I started opening individual messages, my heart sinking with each one. There were texts from Marie saying things like, "See you tomorrow at sunrise," or "Meet me by the old pier." Diane's responses were equally cryptic, but I could feel the intimacy between the lines. This wasn't a woman talking to a friend. This was someone hiding an affair, using a fake name as a front. Then, I stumbled upon the photos. Tucked away in her gallery were a few images that she'd forgotten to delete. They were taken at the beach, Diane, in that same scarf, smiling, leaning into the man I'd seen her with at the cafe. They looked almost too close, his arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder. I felt a rush of nausea as I looked at the photos, realizing that the woman I thought I knew had been leading a double life right in front of me. The sound of the shower shutting off jolted me back to reality. I quickly put her phone back on the charger and moved to the other side of the room, pretending to be engrossed in a book when she emerged. Diane came out wrapped in a towel, her face lit up in a smile that now seemed more like a mask than anything real. She didn't know I'd just uncovered her secret. She had no idea her carefully constructed web of lies was already starting to unravel. As she went about getting dressed, humming softly to herself, I silently vowed that I would make her regret every single lie she'd told, every excuse, every fabricated story. I wasn't going to lose my dignity in some screaming match. No, I was going to do this right. This was going to be a reckoning, and I would make sure she felt the consequences in every part of her life. It was time to get serious. I'd gathered my first pieces of evidence, but there was more to uncover. I knew Diane would slip up again, and when she did, I'd be ready. Over the next few days, I played my part carefully, keeping my suspicions hidden. Diane seemed oblivious, going about her routine with that same relaxed, carefree demeanor as if nothing had changed. But I watched her every move, every glance at her phone, every time she slipped out of the villa for a quick stroll. It was almost infuriating how brazen she was, knowing what I now knew. But I kept my anger in check, using it as fuel to stay focused. I began timing her absences, taking mental notes of her excuses, and waiting for the perfect opportunity to catch her in the act. She continued with her beach yoga charade, leaving at odd hours and returning with a glow that had nothing to do with exercise. It made me sick just watching her pretend, but the more she acted, the more reckless she became, almost like she was testing the limits, pushing to see if I'd ever notice. Then, one evening, she announced she was going out to meet some locals for a special cultural event. I could feel the lie dripping from her words, but I played along, nodding, pretending I was completely clueless. She dressed up more than usual, applying makeup with careful precision, and even put on perfume, a scent she usually saved for special occasions. I asked her casually what the event was about, and she gave me some vague answer about learning the local traditions, insisting it was something she'd heard about from a friend she met at the market. It was the same story she'd spun a few nights back, and I felt that familiar knot in my stomach as she kissed my cheek and walked out the door. As soon as she left, I grabbed my keys and followed her, keeping a good distance so she wouldn't notice. The town was dimly lit, the streets quiet with just a few late-night wanderers. Diane made her way through the main square and down a side street, heading toward the beach. I kept close, careful not to let her out of my sight, but far enough away that she wouldn't catch on. She walked along the beach until she reached a small, hidden pathway behind a row of rocks, disappearing from sight. I waited a few minutes, then carefully followed the same path, staying low, blending into the shadows. Just beyond the rocks, I could see her, a figure standing close to a man, the same man I'd seen her with at the cafe. This time, there was no ambiguity. They weren't just talking. Diane leaned into him, her arms wrapped around his waist as he held her close. I could hear faint murmurs of their conversation, a low, intimate tone that cut through the night air like a dagger. My hands clenched, rage boiling inside me as I watched them embrace under the moonlight, sharing a moment that was supposed to belong to us. They started walking, hand in hand, down the beach toward a small cafe that was still open. I hung back, taking my phone out and snapping a few photos as they went, needing that proof to make my case airtight. They entered the cafe, disappearing inside, and I took a moment to steady myself, to calm the fury threatening to boil over. After about half an hour, they emerged, still wrapped up in each other, and I knew I had enough. I had all the evidence I needed, texts, photos, and now a visual confirmation of her affair. It wasn't just a hunch or a paranoid suspicion anymore. It was cold, hard reality. As I made my way back to the villa, I felt a strange calm wash over me. I'd spent days reeling, questioning myself, agonizing over whether I'd misread the signs. But now, there was no doubt, no room for excuses. Diane had crossed a line she could never come back from, and it was time I took matters into my own hands. I didn't sleep that night, barely moving from my seat on the terrace as I planned my next steps. This wasn't going to be a quiet confrontation or a simple argument. No, Diane had chosen to betray me in the most humiliating way possible, right in front of me, thinking she could get away with it. She was about to find out just how wrong she was. The next morning, I went about the day as if nothing had happened. Diane returned from her yoga session, looking refreshed, her hair damp from what she claimed was a quick dip in the ocean. She gave me that same practice smile, the one I now saw as nothing more than a mask. She had no idea I'd been following her, no clue that I'd seen everything she'd been hiding. I poured us both a cup of coffee, watching her from across the table as she talked about the day's plans. She suggested we explore a nearby vineyard for a wine tasting, a place we'd talked about visiting together since we'd arrived. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was trying to keep up appearances to make it seem like she still wanted to share experiences with me, even while living out her secret life on the side. "Sounds great," I said, keeping my tone light. "I'd love to spend the day with you." My words were laced with a bitterness I was careful not to let slip. I could feel the tension just beneath the surface, that raw, seething anger lurking like an undercurrent. But I had to play it cool. The last thing I wanted was for her to get suspicious. The day at the vineyard was almost surreal. Diane acted as though everything was perfectly normal, laughing, chatting, tasting wine as if she didn't have a care in the world. I found myself studying her, watching the ease with which she played her role, the casual lies that rolled off her tongue without a second thought. She'd perfected the art of deception, right down to the subtle touches, the stolen glances that once would have made me feel loved. Now they felt like poison. At one point, she asked me if I was all right, tilting her head with that concerned look she used to give me. "You seem distracted lately," she said, her voice soft. "Is everything okay?" I forced a smile, looking her right in the eye. "Just a lot on my mind," I replied, holding her gaze a little longer than usual. I wanted to see if she'd flinch, if there was any crack in her perfect facade. But she simply nodded, brushing it off with a reassuring pat on my hand, as if nothing could ever come between us. That evening, back at the villa, she settled in with a book while I went out to the terrace, phone in hand. I couldn't let myself waste time stewing in anger. I had to stay focused, to plan every detail carefully. The evidence I'd gathered wasn't enough on its own. I wanted Diane to face the reality of her actions, to feel the full weight of the betrayal she'd so easily handed me. I started making calls, arranging everything I'd need for our return home. There was going to be a party, a charity event that Diane herself had been planning for months, a gathering of our family, friends, and respected members of our community. She'd wanted this event to be the highlight of her summer, an opportunity to shine in front of everyone she knew. But now it was going to be the stage for her reckoning. In the following days, I continued collecting pieces for the grand reveal. I copied the photos I'd taken onto a secure drive, saved the texts I'd found on her phone, and even downloaded footage from the villa's security cameras showing her coming and going at odd hours. Every piece fit into the story, each one adding to the irrefutable truth of her affair. I would make sure there was no room for denial, no possible way for her to wriggle out of what she'd done. Diane, meanwhile, carried on as if nothing had changed. She kept up her routine of morning yoga, her afternoon shopping trips, her evenings spent meditating by the beach. I followed her one last time, not because I needed more proof, but because I wanted to remind myself of the betrayal, to fuel my resolve. I watched her meet him, her lover, saw them share another intimate moment in that secluded corner by the rocks. It was the final push I needed, the confirmation that any lingering hope I'd had was wasted. When we returned to the villa that night, I felt strangely calm. I knew the storm was coming, that the carefully constructed facade Diane had been living was about to crumble. But for now, I was content to wait, to let her keep playing her part. Soon enough, she'd be facing the consequences of every lie, every betrayal. In just a few days, we'd be back home, surrounded by the people who thought they knew us, thought they understood the bond we shared. Diane had built her life on a lie, and now she was about to see how quickly everything she valued could be stripped away. The flight home was quiet, almost peaceful in its own way. Diane chatted about the vacation, how she'd enjoyed the time to recenter and find herself. Her words felt hollow, almost laughable, considering the truth I now knew. I listened with a calm detachment, letting her speak, nodding in all the right places. If she sensed anything off, she didn't show it. To her, this was just another summer, another holiday to remember. She had no idea it would be her last one, living the life she'd become so comfortable in. As soon as we landed, Diane jumped back into her social routine, planning for the charity event that was now only a week away. This event was her pride and joy, something she'd poured months of effort into. She'd been coordinating guest lists, decorations, even speeches. It was supposed to be a night to highlight our contributions to the community, to showcase her role as the perfect hostess, the dedicated wife. The irony of it all was almost poetic. I, meanwhile, got to work finalizing the details of my own plans. I contacted a trusted friend, someone I'd known for years and could count on for absolute discretion. I laid out what I needed. He'd be handling the tech for the event, setting up a surprise presentation during Diane's speech. My friend didn't ask too many questions, though I could tell he was shocked. I kept it simple, just told him that I needed to reveal the truth to a few key people. He agreed without hesitation, saying he'd have it all set up by the time of the event. Over the next few days, I kept my distance from Diane as much as possible. She was busy, caught up in the preparations, and seemed completely oblivious to the fact that I was working against her behind the scenes. I felt a strange sense of calm, as if all the anger and hurt had settled into a cold determination. I wasn't doing this out of pure revenge. I wanted closure, a sense of justice for everything she'd thrown away so easily. I wanted her to see, in front of everyone she held dear, the cost of her betrayal. The day of the event finally arrived, and Diane was a whirlwind of activity, making last-minute adjustments, giving instructions to the caterers and decorators. She was in her element, radiating confidence and charm as she greeted guests, shaking hands, laughing as if she hadn't a care in the world. I watched her work the room, marveling at how easily she could slip into this role, how effortlessly she could mask her true self. As the evening went on, I mingled with guests, exchanging polite conversation, my mind always half focused on the upcoming reveal. I knew Diane would be delivering her speech soon, a carefully crafted monologue about her dedication to charity and community, complete with a slideshow she'd prepared herself. What she didn't know was that my friend had added a few slides of his own to the presentation. Photos of her with her lover, screenshots of her texts, and even video snippets from the villa's security footage, showing her slipping out in the early hours of the morning. Finally, the time came. Diane took the stage, smiling as she began her speech, her voice warm and confident. She spoke about family values, about loyalty and trust, completely unaware of what was coming. She introduced the slideshow, and the first few images were exactly as she'd planned. Photos of her and me at past charity events, snapshots of our family, all carefully chosen to convey the image of the perfect couple. Then, the screen flickered, and the first image of her affair appeared, a photo of her on the beach, laughing with her lover, his arm around her waist. A murmur went through the crowd as she froze, her face going pale. She glanced over at me, her eyes wide with confusion and fear, as if she couldn't believe what was happening. The next slide showed a screenshot of one of her texts, something sickeningly intimate that made the audience gasp. Diane's hands started to shake as she tried to keep her composure, but the truth was there, laid bare for everyone to see. Slide after slide, photo after photo, the affair unraveled in front of our family, our friends, her carefully crafted social circle. There was no escape, no way to deny it. She turned to me, a look of desperation in her eyes, but I simply met her gaze, cold and unflinching. This was her doing, her choice, her betrayal. She'd built her life on lies, and now she was watching them crumble. The room fell into stunned silence as the final slide appeared, a message I'd prepared in advance. Loyalty is earned, not given. It was the last nail in the coffin, a statement that left no room for sympathy or forgiveness. As I watched Diane stumble off the stage, her image shattered, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The truth was out, and I didn't have to carry it alone anymore. Diane had wanted this night to be the highlight of her summer, a celebration of her so-called devotion. Instead, it had become her reckoning, and she would have to face the consequences in full view of everyone she had deceived. And as the crowd whispered and exchanged shocked glances, I knew that, for the first time in months, I was finally free. As Diane stumbled off the stage, the whispers in the room grew louder, blending into a low hum of shock and disapproval. Some guests had already begun to leave, clearly uncomfortable with the spectacle they'd just witnessed, while others stayed, whispering in clusters, casting sidelong glances at Diane and me. The perfect image she'd worked so hard to create had been shattered in a matter of minutes, and there was no salvaging it now. Diane looked completely lost, standing alone in the corner as she tried to regain her composure. She clutched her hands together, her face pale, eyes darting around the room as if she could find an ally, someone who might come to her defense. But no one approached her. Her friends, the very people she'd relied on to maintain her social standing, were either frozen in shock or too embarrassed to meet her gaze. I stayed back, watching her squirm under the weight of her own choices. She looked at me again, that same desperation in her eyes, as if silently pleading for me to do something, to intervene, to somehow end her public humiliation. But I stood my ground, arms crossed, making it clear that this was her battle to fight. She'd created this mess. She could deal with the fallout. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Diane made her way over to me, her expression shifting from shock to anger, then to something bordering on desperation. I could see her trying to compose herself, scrambling to find the right words. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. "How could you humiliate me like this, in front of everyone?" I raised an eyebrow, feeling a surge of bitter satisfaction. "How could I?" I repeated, my tone ice cold. "How could you, Diane? This isn't about me. It's about you, your choices, your betrayal. You did this to yourself." Her face twisted, the mask she'd worn for so long slipping completely. "I can't believe you'd stoop this low," she hissed. "You just destroyed our life, our reputation, everything we've built." "No, Diane," I replied calmly. "You destroyed it. I simply put a spotlight on it." She opened her mouth to retort, but no words came out. For once, she was speechless, her carefully crafted responses failing her. I could see the panic in her eyes, the realization that she had no control over the situation, no way to spin the story in her favor. All the lies, the excuses, it was all out in the open now, and there was no taking it back. In the midst of our standoff, one of our friends, Barbara, a woman Diane had been close with for years, approached us cautiously. She looked at me, then at Diane, her expression a mixture of pity and disappointment. "Diane," she said softly, I don't even know what to say. I thought I knew you." Diane's face crumpled, the weight of Barbara's words hitting her harder than anything I could have said. "Barbara, please, you have to understand." "No," Barbara interrupted, shaking her head. "There's nothing to understand. We all thought you were someone we could look up to, someone who valued loyalty. I just can't believe this." With that, Barbara turned and walked away, leaving Diane standing there, stunned and broken. One by one, others followed suit, friends, colleagues, acquaintances, all of them offering Diane the same look of disappointment and disbelief as they walked past her. Each goodbye was like another blow, stripping away every bit of social standing she'd fought so hard to maintain. As the crowd thinned, Diane looked around the now nearly empty room, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The humiliation had finally sunk in, and it was clear she knew just how much she'd lost. But even then, I could see a glimmer of defiance in her eyes, as if she still believed she could salvage some part of her old life. When it was finally just the two of us, she turned to me, her voice wavering as she tried to keep herself together. "Please, let's go home and talk about this," she whispered, her voice thick with desperation. "We can figure this out. We don't have to throw everything away." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "There's nothing left to talk about, Diane. You've already thrown it all away. And honestly, I think it's time we stop pretending otherwise." She looked at me, her expression shifting from desperation to despair. For the first time, she truly looked defeated, her shoulders slumping, her mask fully gone. She was just a woman who had gambled everything and lost. I'd waited so long to see this moment, to watch her face the consequences of her actions. And now that it was here, I felt nothing but an empty satisfaction. "Get your things," I said, my tone final. "This party's over. And so is everything else." The drive home was suffocating. The silence between us was thick, pulsing with the weight of everything left unsaid. Diane sat rigidly in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. I could feel her glancing at me, hoping for some sort of reaction, maybe even some sign of forgiveness. But I kept my eyes on the road, jaw set, gripping the steering wheel until my own hands ached. After what felt like an eternity, she finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," she said, almost as if the words themselves were painful to admit. I kept my gaze fixed forward. "Sorry," I repeated, bitterness dripping from my tone. "For what exactly, Diane? For lying? For sneaking around? Or maybe for humiliating me in front of everyone we know?" She flinched, my words hitting their mark. She took a shaky breath and tried again. I know it sounds hollow, but I am sorry. I didn't mean for it to get so out of hand. It just happened. I didn't plan this." "Didn't plan it?" I scoffed, gripping the steering wheel harder. "You didn't plan on lying to my face? Didn't plan on sneaking off during our vacation to meet some stranger like a teenager?" "No. Yes. It's more complicated than that. I wasn't thinking. I was lost, disconnected. And he made me feel young, alive again." Her voice cracked, as if she expected sympathy, maybe even understanding. But I stayed silent, letting her words echo, hollow and meaningless in the car. She reached out, placing a tentative hand on my arm. "Please, you have to understand, I never meant to hurt you." I pulled away, shrugging off her hand like it was poison. "Understand? You're asking me to understand?" I laughed, a cold, bitter sound that felt foreign even to me. "Explain it to me, Diane. I'd love to know how this was supposed to work. You keep me in the dark while you run around, and I'm supposed to just accept it because you were lost?" Her face crumpled, but I felt no pity. If anything, her hurt looked absurd. She was upset now because she was caught, her carefully crafted life shattered. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she murmured, almost to herself. "I don't even know how I got here." I glanced at her, hard and unyielding. "Then enlighten me, Diane. How did you get here? Tell me, because I'd love to know." Her mouth opened, closed, and opened again, like she was struggling to find the words. "I was lonely," she said finally. "And I don't mean just in a physical way. It's been years, and I felt invisible, like I was just existing beside you." I shook my head, almost laughing at the sheer audacity. "So, it's my fault now, is it? I made you feel invisible, so you went looking for validation from a stranger." She winced again, but didn't deny it. "I'm not blaming you, but it's been hard, hasn't it? We've been drifting for so long. You're so wrapped up in work and everything else. I didn't know how to reach you anymore." "You didn't know how to reach me," I repeated, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "So you decided to betray me instead? You thought that was the solution?" Her gaze dropped, and I saw the tears start to well up. But I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy, not after what she'd done. "I didn't plan it," she said again, almost pleading. "I never set out to hurt you. It was just a moment of weakness." "A moment of weakness," I repeated, my voice a low, dangerous tone. "You mean a series of moments? Months, Diane. Lies, excuses, secrecy. This wasn't just one mistake. You made a choice, over and over again." She swallowed, her voice thick with desperation. I know it sounds like I'm making excuses, but please, can't we just talk about this? Work through it. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. Work through what, Diane? You think there's anything left here to work on? I could feel the anger bubbling up, years of loyalty, of trust, all burned up in the fire of her lies. What exactly are we supposed to save? A marriage you've spent months stomping on? It's not that simple, she insisted, her voice rising with desperation. Please, you have to believe me. It didn't mean anything. Didn't mean anything? I repeated, incredulous. That's supposed to make it better? You threw away everything we've built for something that didn't mean anything? Her tears spilled over, running down her cheeks as she shook her head. I was stupid, I know. I was confused, and he was there at the wrong time. But it was nothing, just a distraction, something to make me feel alive. Alive, I repeated, a bitter taste in my mouth. That's what this was about? So, what does that make me, Diane? Some placeholder until you find something more exciting? She shook her head furiously, grabbing at my hand, her grip tight. No, you're everything to me, please. I know I made a mistake, but we can fix this. We can go to therapy, talk to someone, anything. I'll do whatever it takes. I wrenched my hand away, the contact making my skin crawl. Therapy, I spat. You think some therapist is going to fix this? Fix the fact that you spent months lying, sneaking around, destroying every ounce of trust we had. She seemed to shrink, her shoulders slumping as she realized the depth of my anger. I know you're hurt. I know you hate me right now, but please don't throw it all away. We've been through so much together. Don't let this one mistake destroy everything. One mistake. I laughed, a hollow sound that echoed in the car. This wasn't one mistake, Diane. It was betrayal, plain and simple. You chose this. You chose to lie, to deceive, to pretend that everything was fine while you went off with him. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. And I'll be damned if I'm the one to pay the price for it. She sobbed, covering her face with her hands as the realization finally seemed to hit her. There was no going back, no words that could fix what she'd done. The silence settled over us again, broken only by her muffled sobs and the quiet hum of the car. I stared straight ahead, feeling nothing but a cold emptiness where my love for her used to be. I'll do anything, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Just please. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but if you can find it in your heart to try, I'll do whatever it takes. I felt a bitter laugh escape me, low and humorless. Anything? I asked, my tone laced with irony. The one thing I wanted, Diane, was your loyalty, but you gave that to someone else. She broke down completely, her body racked with sobs as she realized the gravity of what she'd lost. But I kept my gaze fixed on the road, numb to her pain, immune to her tears. This was the end, and we both knew it. There was no coming back from this. As we pulled into the driveway, she seemed to regain a shred of composure, wiping her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. Please, she whispered one last time, just give me a chance to make this right. I sat there for a moment, the engine still running, my mind spinning with everything that had happened. Finally, I turned to her, my voice cold and final. There's no fixing this, Diane. You made your choice. Now you'll have to live with it. With that, I stepped out of the car, leaving her alone with her tears, her guilt, and the weight of her own betrayal. The days following that drive were a blur of tension, silence, and the slow, painful process of untangling our lives. Diane tried everything she could to make things right, as she called it, but it was far too late for that. Whatever connection we once had was gone, replaced by a void where trust, love, and loyalty had once lived. For the first few days, she was relentless. Diane flooded me with apologies, alternating between begging for forgiveness and making emotional pleas. She promised change, claimed she'd cut off all contact with the other man, offered to go to therapy, even brought up taking a trip together to reconnect. Each offer was a desperate attempt to salvage a version of our life that no longer existed, a life she'd single-handedly destroyed. I, however, refused to engage. Her words, her tears, her promises, they all felt empty, like the remnants of a person I'd once known but who had betrayed me too deeply to ever come back from it. I couldn't bring myself to respond to her pleas, nor could I pretend that any of her promises held weight anymore. The love we'd built over 3 decades had been irreparably tainted, and no amount of counseling or reconnecting would ever change that. One morning, I found Diane sitting on the living room couch, a stack of old photo albums spread out in front of her. She was flipping through them, stopping to linger on the images of our younger selves, the smiles and laughter we'd once shared. It was almost comical, the way she tried to summon the past, as if a few dusty photos could erase months of deception. She looked up as I entered the room, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Look," she whispered, holding up a picture of us from one of our early vacations. "Remember this trip? We were so happy back then. We can get back to that, can't we? If we just try." I stared at the photo, the memory feeling like it belonged to someone else, a distant version of myself who had trusted her with everything. "No, Diane," I said quietly. "Those people in that photo don't exist anymore. You killed them the moment you decided to lie to me." Her face crumpled, and she clutched the photo tightly, as if it were the last connection she had to our past. "Please don't say that. I know I was wrong, but I can change. I can be the wife you deserve, I swear." "Change?" I repeated, shaking my head. "You don't get it, do you? It's not about changing. It's about the fact that you made a choice, over and over again, to betray me. This wasn't one mistake. It was months of lying, sneaking, pretending." She looked down, her grip on the photo loosening as my words sank in. For the first time, I saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes, a glimpse of the reality she'd been trying to avoid. "So, that's it," she whispered. "You're really done with me?" I took a deep breath, the finality of my decision settling over me like a weight lifted. "Yes, Diane, I'm done. You destroyed everything we had, and there's no coming back from that." After that conversation, the next steps were quick and to the point. We agreed to separate, though Diane's reaction was one of disbelief and despair. She'd thought her apologies, her promises, would be enough to salvage the marriage, but she was slowly beginning to realize that no words could fix what she'd broken. The divorce process started soon after. I went through every detail with a fine-tooth comb, making sure Diane understood that this wasn't a temporary break or a wake-up call. This was the end. We divided our assets, untangling the life we'd shared, reducing decades of memories to financial transactions and legal agreements. In the community, word of her affair spread quickly, leaving Diane isolated and ostracized from the very circle she'd once valued so much. Friends who had once idolized her, who had looked up to her as a paragon of loyalty, now saw her for who she really was, a woman who had shattered her own life through betrayal. The social fallout was brutal, and she became the subject of whispered conversations, hushed judgments, and quiet avoidance. I watched from a distance as her world crumbled around her, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness. She had fought so hard to maintain her image, her reputation, and now she was left with nothing but the consequences of her actions. She tried reaching out to mutual friends, attempting to salvage some form of connection, but most of them wanted nothing to do with her anymore. Her betrayal had not only ruined our marriage, but had also tarnished every relationship she'd built on the foundation of lies. Months passed, and Diane continued her attempts to reach me, to somehow convince me to give us another chance. She left voicemails, sent letters, even tried to contact our children to get them on her side. But I stayed firm, refusing to let her back into my life. My children understood, and they made it clear that any contact they had with her would be on their terms, not through manipulation or guilt. One evening, as I sat alone in my new apartment, I listened to a voicemail Diane had left earlier in the day. Her voice was weak, barely audible, and filled with a kind of desperation I'd never heard before. "I know I don't deserve anything from you," she said. "But please, if there's any part of you that remembers the love we had, please let me back in. I'm lost without you." I deleted the message without hesitation. The woman on that voicemail was a stranger to me, a ghost of the person I'd once loved. There was nothing left to salvage, no reason to reopen wounds that were finally beginning to heal. In the end, Diane became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the cost of betrayal. She'd had everything: a loving husband, a stable family, a respected place in the community, and she'd thrown it all away for a fleeting, meaningless affair. Her life was now a reflection of that choice, empty and isolated, defined by the very actions she had so carelessly justified. As for me, I found a strange sense of peace in the solitude. I'd lost a marriage, a partnership I'd once believed would last a lifetime, but I'd also gained clarity. Diane's betrayal had been a painful wake-up call, a reminder that trust is fragile, that love can be easily tainted by selfishness. But I'd emerged from it stronger, more aware of the things I valued most: honesty, loyalty, and respect. I knew that the scars Diane had left would remain with me, a permanent mark on my heart and mind. But I also knew that, in time, they would fade. I would rebuild, reshape my life without her, and move forward with the knowledge that, in the end, I had made the right choice. I had chosen dignity over deception, truth over illusion, and I had walked away from a life built on lies. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from the weight of Diane's betrayal, free from the empty promises, and free from the person I had become in the shadow of her deceit. The life I had now was quieter, simpler, but it was mine, and that, I realized, was worth more than any illusion of happiness ever could be.